There is an attempt to push someone out of the discourse and deny them participation in the discussion. For example, I am not invited to many conferences because my academic integrity is called into question, and perhaps it would also be a burden if my name appeared on the list of participants. It is absolutely clear to me that I no longer have much opportunity for academic development in the German-speaking world. The opportunities for development within the circle of colleagues are limited because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a deliberate effort to discredit my position so that people can then say, of course, we don't want anything to do with this outcast who works dishonestly and improperly.
Hallo zusammen. Pascal here from Neutrality Studies.
Hello everyone, Pascal here from Neutrality Studies. And today I'm speaking with Austrian political scientist and university professor Gerhard Mangott. Professor Mangott teaches at the University of Innsbruck, focusing on international relations and security in the post-Soviet space. Professor Mangott is also a frequent guest in German-language media and is one of the increasingly rare voices advocating for a prudent Russia policy. For this, he has repeatedly faced criticism, and in recent weeks, there has been an outright smear campaign against him on Twitter X. What I find alarming in this context is that he is even being accused of wanting to build bridges to Russia, which, apparently, in the current European climate, is already considered a reproach, a kind of social crime. We want to talk today about the attacks against you and the radicalization of the discourse regarding Russia. Mr. Mangott, welcome. Good afternoon. Could you perhaps tell us what you are currently experiencing? You comment quite frequently as various media outlets ask you about Russia policy. And right now I see a lot of hateful comments and very, very harsh criticism directed at you on Twitter. What exactly is happening at the moment?
Basically, these are attacks from accounts that don't use real names, but there are certainly also comment farms involved that simply formulate criticism in order to discredit me personally. Now, I'm being accused of not being scientifically honest or having integrity, and as a consequence, being, whether paid or unpaid, a servant in the public statements of the Russian leadership, a servant in spreading Russian narratives. And I think that's something that bothers scientists the most.
Das ist etwas, was den Wissenschaftler, glaube ich, am meisten stört. Es ist ja nicht, dass der Widerspruch, die Kritik.
It's not that opposition or criticism is something you don't want to experience. On the contrary, criticism is particularly useful for sharpening your own position, or even changing it if you are convinced that someone else has better arguments. But that's not what this is about. It's about real hate comments, sometimes in extremely harsh language, which are solely aimed at discrediting the person, in this case, me, and spreading falsehoods, lies, and distortions. And the problem is that you can hardly defend yourself against this legally, especially not against accounts that don't use real names.
Schon gar nicht gegen Accounts ohne Klarnamen.
Yes,
so one of the comments that actually motivated me to write it comes from an account, let me see where I have it, called Vic. He posted an entire thread, 16 posts, about you and writes here that you pretend to be an expert. But actually, you're probably connected to the Kremlin, because you're accused of having a nice photo of the Kremlin, that is, of Moscow, on your homepage. And as an expert on the post-Soviet region, who has now researched this topic for 20 or 30 years, people want to accuse you of having long-standing relationships with your research subject. Could you maybe say something about that?
Yes, it
is astonishing when a scientist who has worked in the field of research on Russia for a very long time, in my case, 39 years, is accused because he, or in my specific case, I, post a picture of the Kremlin, the decision-making center of Russian politics, on my homepage as documentation of my research activities. If someone were to post the White House, it would probably be met with little or no criticism. But just because I post the Kremlin, simply as a signal to the users of my website that this is about Russia, primarily about Russia, it is already seen as an accusation and supposed proof that I am in the service of the Kremlin, paid or unpaid.
Dieser Post, ich muss den einfach kurz vorlesen, weil
I just have to quickly read out this post, because I can hardly process it. Mangott may be a professor in Innsbruck, but mentally, he seems to reside somewhere between Moscow and St. Petersburg. While Europe is building walls of sanctions, he's building bridges, mainly because he doesn't live in Ukraine, but reads OSCE reports in a cafe in Innsbruck. You're really being accused. Your crime is building bridges. Could you maybe briefly comment on that?
Können Sie sich dazu vielleicht noch kurz äußern?
Basically, one has to say that the range of interpretation, or you could also call it the range of opinion, is simply very, very narrow. The debate about Russia and Russia's war against Ukraine is extremely restricted, emotional, polarized, and no longer objective. And in this role that I have, where I also try to point out ways out of this war and develop different scenarios, it is of course also about how Europe will deal with Russia in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Because one thing is unchangeable: geography. Russia will remain the neighbor of the European Union, and therefore the European Union needs a policy toward Russia. And of course, that can and must be one of the sanctions and political isolation in the short term. But in the long run, that's not really a strategy with which you can conduct sensible politics. That's why I also argue that on the European side, we need to consider how we deal with Russia and under what conditions. Some want to build bridges, and this user is criticizing me for that. By the way, I don't read OSCE reports, because there is hardly anything in them that actually provides information about what is happening within the decision-making apparatus in Moscow, and what intentions, interests, and goals the Russian side is pursuing in this war of aggression.
Das für mich Bizarre an der momentanen Situation.
What strikes me as bizarre about the current situation is that building bridges, or even fostering an understanding of how decision-making processes work in Moscow, and what actually dominates the political discourse in Russia, is something that really annoys these users or attackers at the moment. What they want is a relatively narrow, confined image. A caricature of Russia in which Vladimir Putin is an evil despot who, as Iago says in Othello, acts out of the evil in his heart. Let me do evil today. Anyone who does not support this image is already accused in the German-speaking world of being a Putin sympathizer. The bizarre thing is that, as scholars, we are supposed to engage precisely with why people make decisions for certain reasons. Is it even possible to do good academic work in Europe in this heated situation?
Gute wissenschaftliche Arbeit zu leisten in Europa.
Well, not when you go public. If you're writing a paper or a book in the seclusion of a researcher's office, you can more or less cope with what the outside world says. But as soon as you enter social media, or like me, are very present in the media, in the German-speaking world with interviews, discussions, and commentaries, that's when the pushback begins, if I can put it that way. Certain accounts, or whatever the background of these actors may be, are specifically trying to destroy this person, to discredit them. Media outlets are even deliberately contacted so that I won't be interviewed anymore. There have been some campaigns since the beginning of the war that you simply can't defend yourself against. But my position as a political scientist is that a political scientist should also share their research findings with the public, communicate with the populations of different countries, in order to provide them, from my perspective, with a proper and presumably accurate assessment of political events so that they can form their own orientation. And that's also the reason why I continue my work, despite these inflammatory comments. precisely because I don't want to leave the discourse to those who want to control the debate in a completely polarized, emotionalized, and one-sided way.
Die Debatte kontrollieren wollen.
Genau, wir sind ja jetzt hier im Raum der Debatten.
Exactly. We are now in the realm of debate control, meaning the problem is not only about understanding what the other side, Russia, is doing, but also about how we think about it. Because that will influence politics, or the scope of what is possible within politics in Europe. In other words, simply put, within the realm of what is usually called propaganda. To what extent have you noticed a hardening of the discourse over the past 3 years, during which this conflict, that is, the large-scale war since 2022, has continued? And where do you think we currently stand in terms of what is still considered acceptable?
Gängig noch akzeptiert wird.
Ich glaube, wenn man die wissenschaftlichen Debatten, die auch
I believe that if you look at scientific debates, which can certainly be quite spiteful, you come to the conclusion that certain actors, and this is the majority of them, try to prevent anyone from understanding what the other side thinks, how they perceive things, because it is immediately assumed that understanding the other actor means having sympathy for their behavior, sympathy for their political decisions. But that's absurd. We should all try to understand as thoroughly and completely as possible what an actor does, what they think, how they perceive things. But the other implication, that if you understand, you also sympathize, is, in my opinion, scientifically quite poor.
Wissenschaftlicher armselig, würde ich meinen. Und das hängt auch mit dem Umstand zusammen, den ich zumindest.
And that is also related to a circumstance that I criticize, at least from my scientific perspective, namely, that many experts, including professors at universities, have essentially left the field of science since the beginning of this war, if I may put it bluntly, and have moved into the realm of activism. That means they suddenly see themselves as actors who want to actively influence politics in the context of this war. Of course, one can do that, but when a scientist becomes an activist, they cannot simultaneously continue to fulfill the role of a scientist. They simply move into a different sphere.
Bewegt sich einfach in eine andere Sphäre. Und da habe ich mein großes.
And I have already expressed my deep regret about this several times, and was then insulted for it, that as scientists, we are supposed to try not to engage in politics. That is the task of the political elites. But rather, we should try to show which decisions that are made, or could be made, might lead to which outcomes in which scenarios. That's what a scientist does. He is the observer, the one who classifies, the interpreter, but he is not part of politics. But the majority of German-speaking Russia and security researchers see themselves in this conflict, in this emotionally charged, discourse-driven conflict, as a party to the war. And that is something that is very damaging to science.
Etwas, was sehr schädlich ist für die Wissenschaft.
Ja, da gebe ich Ihnen recht. Es ist nur auch sehr schwierig, das zu trennen.
Yes, I agree with you on that. It's just very difficult to separate the two. After all, understanding how something works usually goes hand in hand with opinions about how to operate the machine you believe you understand. That's why my view is always that you should simply state which judgments you're starting from, and then present your perspective. And then there are other perspectives, and you have to tolerate them. But in the course of the discussion, you often gain more than what you started with. But now one side is definitely trying to push the other side out of the discourse. And it seems you yourself have already become persona non grata for this form or this side of academic activism. How is it with your university and your academic colleagues? Is the way you express yourself still within the bounds of how people interact in academia in Europe? Or are you also experiencing pressure from other sides?
Oder erfahren Sie auch Druck von anderer Seite?
Es ist so, dass ich einfach traurigerweise sagen muss, dass die Universität.
Well, the sad truth is that I have to say my university completely abandons you when you become the target of hate campaigns. I even once heard, you shouldn't always portray yourself as the victim, because you're not. That means you can't trust your superiors or the university administration to support you, or to take measures intended to protect individual academics and actually help them.
Gedacht sind und dabei auch helfen. Bei Kollegen ist es so an meinem Institut.
At my institute, my colleagues mostly don't really notice it, they don't acknowledge it. So there's no pressure there. But there is pressure from the research community. In my case, especially in the German-speaking world, particularly in Germany, where you find that even scientists, colleagues who should actually be committed to the principle of getting as close to reality as possible and interpreting it, personally defame you.
Dass diese Kollegen einen persönlich diffamieren. Ich kann ganz konkret eine Person nennen.
I can name a specific person, Professor Carlo Massala from the Bundeswehr University in Munich, who, when I wrote exactly what I just said on X, that scientists are falling into the role of activists, responded, "That is a shabby comment," and then began systematically posting accusations against me on X, really with the aim of simply saying, in my specific case, Mr. Mangott, but it also affects many others, that I can't be trusted because I'm not honest and that I actually am, or as some might even say, definitely an agent of the Russian side and want to spread Russian narratives. And that is really something that is very, very regrettable, something that is also saddening, that among colleagues there seems to be a complete loss of respect and an unwillingness to tolerate that others have different opinions, and that alongside a mainstream view, there are also minority positions, among which I count myself in this conflict.
Zu denen ich mich in diesem Konflikt zähle.
Wann haben wir diese
When did we lose, or at least forfeit, this ability for discourse? I think it's not completely gone yet. I also believe that we still have the opportunity, especially in the sciences in Europe, North America, and so on, to express ourselves somewhat independently. It's not an absolutely repressive environment. But we are seeing this synchronization. I consider it a kind of sociological phenomenon, and we already observed during the pandemic that the pressure to express oneself within certain boundaries increases dramatically, and that even scientific counterpositions, even if you think they're nonsense, are no longer allowed or even wanted to be allowed to gain any attention. I attribute some of this to the pandemic as well, but do you see any other reasons why we are currently moving into this kind of synchronization?
Ein Grund dafür, dass wir im Moment in diese Gleichtaktung hineinlaufen.
Ich muss sagen, es hängt sicherlich auch damit zusammen.
I have to say, it certainly also has to do with the fact that scientists seek media exposure, and they know that if they take a certain position, they are no longer in that media space, or at least they are in a much smaller media space, because certain media outlets simply stop interviewing people who think outside the mainstream. I also believe that many scientists consider, what about commissioned research? What implications could a controversial, non-mainstream position actually have for funding activities and for their own scientific work?
Fördertätigkeit für das eigene wissenschaftliche Arbeiten, auch das ist sicherlich ein Faktor, der hier
That is certainly a factor that plays a role here. And I think this tipping point actually coincides with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was obvious then that many scientists felt, and still feel, that they had to get involved in a kind of activist way. They feel they must call for arms deliveries, which I find completely absurd for a scientist. I would handle it by saying, if this or that weapon system is delivered, then the following consequences can be expected.
Dann sind folgende Konsequenzen zu erwarten. Das kann ein Wissenschaftler tun. Aber wenn ein Professor für
A scientist can do that. But when a professor of international relations says that the Taurus cruise missile, must be delivered, or that tanks must be delivered, this campaign by scientists with the hashtag Free Leopard, meaning delivered, in reference to the German Bundeswehr's Leopard 2 tanks, when scientists get so involved, not just in political consulting, but actually exerting influence on politics, that's where, for me, scientific work, scientific activity comes to an end.
wissenschaftliche Tätigkeit auf.
Ja, da gebe ich Ihnen recht.
Yes, I agree with you on that. I always think about what that means for me as well, because I always try to say, no, if anything, scientists should actually be arguing for peace and de-escalation, Although in your view, that is also a form of activism. And you're right, you really have to think carefully about what you do.
Man muss sich gut überlegen, was man tut.
Ja, also da würde ich
Yes, so I would, excuse me for interrupting you, I would say, if someone has, so to speak, an emancipatory understanding of political science that is directed towards certain value goals, I still wouldn't see that as activism. Rather, it is simply a legitimate academic position. No one has to take the same position as I do, where I say, as an analyst, I have to be completely indifferent to who wins the war in Ukraine. So, I'm not saying that my understanding of science should be the general understanding of science.
Das allgemeine Wissenschaftsverständnis sein soll, eine Werteorientierung,
A value orientation, an activity as a political scientist guided by ethical norms, is just as legitimate as, so to speak, my own approach. But how one actually behaves in public, given a commitment to certain values in one's own political science research, is a completely different matter. For example, if someone says, yes, I want peace, Russia must be defeated, so we have to deliver weapons, we have to sanction Russia, we have to enable as many military activities by Ukraine on Russian soil as possible. For me, that is no longer merely value-based, but rather political influence and political behavior.
Einfluss nehmen und politisches Verhalten.
Ja, und auch ein Versuch.
Yes, and also an attempt to manipulate public perception. And that's something that many of us dislike. That we feel a demon is being constructed on the other side that simply does not correspond to reality. And if you have an image of the enemy that isn't based on reality, you end up making decisions that can be disastrous. So there should actually be a general interest in capturing these realities as objectively as possible. Is it already the case in Europe, in Austria, perhaps in the German-speaking world, that we've slipped so far into this war rhetoric that an objective assessment is no longer even desired socially by a majority of people?
Sozial, also von einer Mehrheit der Leute.
Also, was ich erlebe aus Reaktionen.
So what I experience from the reactions of the public on the street to my media appearances, they actually praise me for looking at the conflict objectively and neutrally, and they trust what I say. They often say that I am, so to speak, the benchmark for objectivity. What I say can be believed.
Das kann geglaubt werden. Das ist natürlich schön für den Wissenschaftler, aber
of course, that's nice for the scientist, but the point is that I believe that at the scientific level, we're simply only dealing with campaigns now, that scientists are participating in campaigns and are no longer seeking scientific discourse in the sense of exchanging arguments, discussing, weighing arguments. Instead, scientists are saying, we want to monopolize the discourse in collaboration with the media. And here, it's primarily public broadcasters in the German-speaking world. And any criticism of this mainstream discourse, which also serves to legitimize what Western European or Western governments are doing, anything that goes against this campaignization of the correctness of European and Western policy, is used to immediately portray any attempt to understand the other side of the conflict, to understand their interests, perceptions, and goals, as a deviation from the moral mainstream consensus, and as something indecent, something unscientific.
Und als etwas Unanständiges, etwas Unwissenschaftliches. Es gab niemals einen dümmeren wissenschaftlichen, nein, es ist kein Wissenschaftler.
There has never been a dumber scientific, no, it's not even a scientific term, but never a dumber term than Putin's sympathizer. Because understanding phenomena that we study, let me correct myself, understanding research subjects is actually the ultimate goal of any scientific activity. And from that, I can also derive scenarios. What happens if politics behaves this way or that way? That doesn't mean you sympathize with what Russia is doing, but you have to examine Russia's motives. You have to grasp and understand the Russian perception of Western behaviors and Western policies, and analyze how much that influences, for example, the actions of the Russian side.
Wie sehr das auf das Handeln etwa der russischen Seite Einfluss nimmt. Da geht es in einem nicht moralischen, aber völkerrechtlichen.
This is not about saying, in a non-moral, but rather international law sense, that Russia is not solely to blame for this war. Of course, Russia acted wrongly in a political situation it perceived as dangerous, specifically by violating international law and breaking the United Nations prohibition on the use of force. But one must understand how, from the Russian perspective, this situation came about, and what options Russian politics even saw in the lead-up to this war. As I said, it's about understanding, not about sympathy. I must also say openly, it is of course completely ahistorical to claim that on February 24, 2022, Putin personally, and thus Russian foreign policy is entirely personalized, decided to invade Ukraine, and that there was no prior history leading up to this. My position is, Western states have also made mistakes in their policies toward Russia, whether intentionally or unintentionally, which have created a perception on the Russian side that then led Russia to a fatal misjudgment. That does not mean I hold the West responsible for Russia's decision to go to war, but I am saying, such a decision, as wrong as it is, in various respects, has a backstory into which this decision is embedded. And we have to try, without blinders, to examine and understand who shaped and directed this backstory, and how, so that Russia ultimately made a completely wrong and unacceptable decision to wage a war of aggression.
And right now, if we just set aside the evaluation of the attack for a moment, and focus on what we're currently observing in Europe, we see that on the one hand, we have these loaded terms, and this word Putin versteher, Putin sympathizer, or Putin understander. This conversation is also being translated into English, French, and other languages, and this word doesn't even exist in those languages. It's only in German that it's used as an accusation that someone might be able to understand Mr. Putin. Interestingly, this accusation always comes from people who will immediately say, "Let me tell you how to really understand him, because you're understanding him incorrectly." Essentially, it's the accusation that you're misunderstanding Putin, or rather, interpreting him differently than they do. And secondly, that we have created this equivalence. And I have already noticed this even among highly educated colleagues, who mentally no longer understand that there is a difference between explanation and justification. In this narrative, it is equated that if you explain why Russia did something, and this explanation differs from the explanation of those who claim interpretive authority, also a nice German word, Deutungshoheit, then by explaining, you're already justifying. Maybe the question goes too far, but can you explain why, within this narrative, we are no longer able to make this distinction? And did this start with Russia? Or does it go further back to the 2000s or 1990s, when we began to equate explanation with justification?
Well, when someone who is explaining something is accused of justifying it, this happens in a situation or context where others, who claim interpretive authority for themselves, want to prevent any criticism of their mainstream discourse at all costs. The monopolization of discourse, and this often happens in close coordination with politics, must not be disrupted by differing views, opinions, or interpretations. And that brings me to a second accusation I want to make. I believe that some colleagues quite deliberately adopt government narratives in the West. For example, this almost hysterical debate, when will Russia attack NATO? When will Ivan, so to speak, be in Berlin and Paris? And they present and portray it as a given that Russia, after Ukraine, no matter how that conflict turns out, will inevitably turn against Europe. The Russian army, the Russian leadership, will turn against Europe. And the science that presents this scenario as a certainty and interprets any criticism of this scenario as criticism guided by Russian narratives, of course, also provides politics with the corresponding explanatory framework by, in a sense, granting politicians that they must respond to this supposedly certain threat, with rearmament on their own side, and military support for the Ukrainian side. In effect, the Ukrainians are putting their lives on the line in the war against Russia so that Russia does not turn against the West. And that is the participation of science in the ideology of domination. And that is something I find completely unacceptable. It is possible that Russia has ambitions. No, Russia does have ambitions. It is also possible that Russia will make another fatal mistake and attack a neighboring country. That is possible, but not likely.
Das ist möglich, aber nicht wahrscheinlich. Aber in der Debatte wird dieses Szenario eines russischen Angriffs.
But in the debate, this scenario of a Russian attack is even being scheduled. The Potsdam historian Sönke Neitzel, for example, has said that we may be experiencing the last summer in peace. Masala says that by 2029 at the latest, there will be an attempt by Russia to exert influence, possibly even a military attack, meaning that we are already starting to set certain measures on a timeline, and thereby justifying that politics is putting all resources into the field of armament. I absolutely do not mean that the Western European armies, which in many cases are not combat-ready or operational, should not be better equipped, because defense capability and deterrence are always an important part of a state's security policy.
Ist immer ein wichtiger Bestandteil der Sicherheitspolitik eines Staates. Also das kritisiere ich ja nicht. Aber was ich kritisiere ist,
well, that's not what I'm criticizing. What I am criticizing is that scientists are in a way supporting this political goal by justifying their own rearmament through stoking fear of Russia's supposed ambitions. The point is, if Western European countries, some of which are in very poor budgetary situations, now have to handle two tasks, their own rearmament and military support for Ukraine, then of course the question arises, how is this supposed to be financed? And there is no way to finance it that doesn't mean a burden for policy in other areas, especially social policy.
In der Sozialpolitik. Und damit diese Diskussion nicht aufkommt, was sind
And so, that this discussion doesn't arise, what are our spending preferences, where do we allocate funds, how do we finance this or that, there is this dominant narrative. We are in a situation where a Russian attack is imminent and where we must be ready for war, to use Pistorius's term. In my view, some scholars are serving this ruling ideology by supposedly supporting it scientifically and communicating it as such in the media.
angeblich wissenschaftlich unterstützen und in den Medien auch so kommunizieren.
Hier, Sie haben das jetzt sehr schön dargelegt, also auch wie die...
You've just explained very clearly how this spiral of internal European escalation works, with media professionals collaborating with people from academia who share certain interpretations. And then these interpretations flow into politics. And of course, politics also has a feedback effect. Because as you just said, certain research funding can indeed be tied to whether you hold a particular position or not. Can we talk briefly about that? Are you concerned that your own research funding, your own opportunities to operate within the European academic sphere, are now being restricted by this situation? Or have they already been restricted?
Durch diese Situation einschränkt oder wurde sie schon eingeschränkt?
Also ich würde meine Position als eine Position der
Well,
Marginalisierung.
I would describe my position as one of marginalization in the German-speaking world. That means there are attempts to push someone out of the field of discourse and to deny participation in the discourse. For example, I am not invited to many conferences because my academic integrity is called into question. It might also be considered a burden if my name appears on the list of participants. For me, it is absolutely clear that I no longer have much opportunity for academic development in the German-speaking world. The opportunities for development within the circle of colleagues are limited because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a deliberate effort to discredit my position so that people can then say, of course we don't want anything to do with this outcast who works dishonestly and improperly.
Und das wirkt sich darauf aus, dass man zum Beispiel in bestimmten Fachzeitschriften.
And this has an effect, for example, in that you can no longer publish in certain academic journals. If I tried to publish something in the Journal of the German Association for East European Studies, based on my interpretation of the conflict, I expect, of course, I can't know for sure and the editorial board would completely deny it, but I expect that such an article simply wouldn't be published because it doesn't fit into the opinion-shaping editorial work there. So yes, as a scholar, you can also be marginalized. And some scholars then succumb to the temptation to, so to speak, serve the other side, or offer themselves to the other side, which I do not do. But you certainly do experience concrete punishments if you move too far outside the corridor of accepted opinion.
Außerhalb des Meinungskorridors bewegt und auf einen anderen Aspekt möchte ich ja noch hin.
And I'd like to point out another aspect. It's not just about scientific marginalization, so to speak, but the whole thing also has to be processed psychologically. Of course, there's the saying, if you can't stand the heat, don't enter the kitchen. And you could say, Mr. Mangott, if you go public, you have to be able to handle being criticized. But, as I've already said, it's not about criticism, it's about defamation, and enduring defamation, especially when the very foundation of my scientific existence is being destroyed, namely that I work with integrity and honesty, is something you have to process psychologically. Sometimes you manage that well, sometimes less so, and sometimes not at all.
Manchmal weniger gut und manchmal gar nicht. Und das ist nämlich auch etwas, das indirekt.
And that is also something that indirectly leads to a kind of intimidation. Certain topics are no longer discussed at all. People stop posting about certain issues simply because there is already a certain fear of what the reaction will be, which one may not always be able to handle psychologically, or not at all. And that is absolutely fatal. So, in addition to marginalization, the psychological destruction of those who think differently is something that, to me, is completely destructive and clearly shows that we are no longer engaged in a rational discourse.
Dokumentiert, dass wir in keinem rationalen Diskurs mehr sind.
Ja, es ist ja auch, was die ganze Kriegspsychologie.
Yes, it's also the case that what drives the whole psychology of war, what pushes an entire society into war, is precisely that discourse is no longer possible because of this chilling effect on genuine exchange about what's happening. This causes the corridor to become narrower and narrower until ultimately sending troops to the front is the only strategy that dominates and is accepted by society. And that's how entire societies are made to rush into disaster.
Gesamte Gesellschaften dazu ins Verderben hineinzurennen. Und mein
And my great fear is that Europe is currently moving exactly in that direction. It's not about waking up in the morning and saying, today I want to go to war. It's about this slow settling into the certainty that now, just as has already been said in some German media, and also by a scientist, by a historian, that mothers must be willing, against their will, to sacrifice their sons. I don't remember who said it, but a historian expressed it that way in the German context.
Im deutschen Raum kundgetan.
Ich weiß den Namen auch nicht, aber ich habe das auch gelesen, ja, und habe mich.
I don't know the name either, but I read that as well, and was actually astonished by this statement, the enlistment of so-called science into war rhetoric. We must not forget, of course it's much worse in Russia, and I say that as a kind of self-protection. But we live in Western societies, especially in Europe, and there is not only a militarization of discourse, but also a militarization of social life. For example, when it's said that the German Bundeswehr has to go into schools and essentially introduce itself and explain what the Bundeswehr does. And what's often less explicitly stated, essentially recruiting for the armed forces, already at a child or youth age. That is a harsh militarization of public life, which I find alarming.
Die erschreckend ist, meiner Ansicht nach.
Und innerhalb dieses Diskurses auch für uns, Sie sind
And within this discourse, also for us, you are Austrian, I am Swiss. We also have neutrality policy as part of our national security policy, and you can currently see how attacks on this non-militaristic or less militaristic security policy are underway, and how support for neutrality is already being equated with misjudging the actual threat scenario.
des tatsächlichen Bedrohungsszenarios.
Wir haben eine solche Debatte natürlich in Österreich auch, wo die
We are, of course, having a similar debate in Austria, where neutrality is being called into question, where it is said that neutrality does not protect us, which, when viewed objectively and historically empirically, is actually true. but that is not an argument against seeking or maintaining a neutral status nonetheless. It is also clear, of course, that neutrality requires defensive capability, material defensive capability, but the discourse is, we need a unified European bloc where only NATO states operate, and any other security policy orientation, which then also understands security policy as more than just military policy, is discredited. In such a situation, it is naturally extremely difficult for a scholar to be heard at all without, as has often been emphasized, being discredited. And as I said, reducing security policy to military policy is intellectually extremely lacking. Of course, there is a military component to security policy, but that's just one component among many others, and I have the feeling that everything else is being neglected or portrayed as ineffective or no longer important, and the focus is now solely on military policy, on war readiness, on war capability. The way this is becoming more and more intense in the political discourse, supported by certain academic elites, and I believe that this development will continue even more strongly in this direction, and that in 2 years we might look back and be glad that we still had more room for discourse today than we will have in 2 years. That's how pessimistic I actually am in this regard.
So pessimistisch bin ich diesbezüglich eigentlich.
Ich auch. Also ich habe das Gefühl, die Chancen, dass in 2 Jahren...
Me too. I have the feeling that the chances these YouTube channels won't exist anymore in 2 years are pretty high, or that they won't be accessible anymore, that they'll be blocked. We're already at the point where Europe, well, not Switzerland, but the EU, has blocked RT and Sputnik, meaning Russian media outlets. Switzerland didn't do that. The Swiss government argues that this doesn't align with their understanding of a liberal society. That's a very interesting criticism of the EU. By the way, Japan didn't do it either. So we can see, at various points within the Western discourse, what should still be allowed and what shouldn't. But I also feel that the discourse on social media is becoming more restricted, and the temptation for governments to suppress this part of the discourse will probably increase.
Auch diesen Teil des Diskurses abzuwehren, wahrscheinlich zunehmen wird.
Ja, ich glaube, das, was man als Ghosting bezeichnet.
Yes, I believe that what is referred to as ghosting is becoming increasingly prevalent. Ghosting arises from certain targeted algorithms in social media. It happens when influential media channels stop broadcasting certain viewpoints, no longer allow them, and exclude or sideline everyone who represents those positions. And ghosting goes so far that, for example, when it comes to the possibility of obtaining public funding for one's own research, as already mentioned, this opportunity is simply being diminished as well. And ghosting is, I believe, a concept that we still need to engage with very intensively, and whose meaning we need to come to terms with. We have to realize that ghosting simply comes from actors over whom we have no control, and against whom we as individuals are completely defenseless and have no real power. We can't really counteract the process, so to speak. If someone is ghosted, what are they supposed to do? Precisely because they are being ghosted, they can hardly get their own position out there anymore. At least not in the mass media of public broadcasting. And that's where, not in Austria, but in Germany, there are already some serious problems, I have to say.
It's also an extremely difficult topic, because we have almost no methodology to even approach it. And then there's the temptation to just blame things on ghosting, which is relatively high. I've had this discussion several times with other colleagues who post videos on YouTube and say, yeah, my videos always get a rapid increase at the beginning, and then they level off and are basically dead. So they're not being watched anymore, and that's supposed to be a sign of ghosting. And I have to say, no, that's not true. That's just how news broadcasts behave in this space. Every single one of my videos behaves that way. But if you don't know that, if you don't have a point of comparison, then that suspicion seems obvious. You can see it's difficult to distinguish what is normal distribution and what is, in a certain sense, manipulated.
Das ist schon methodisch, haben Sie da völlig, und methodologisch haben Sie da völlig.
That is methodologically absolutely correct, that we are partly on thin ice here. But of course, one can already use the term ghosting based on observation when certain experiences are made. For example, a radio station with a high level of information content, I won't say which German-speaking country it's in, has not interviewed me for 11 years. And the point is, I know from an editor at this outlet that there are certain editors there who do everything they can to prevent me from going on air, and who also attack me on social media.
Und die auch in den sozialen Medien mich attackieren. Und nur um das den Zuhörern und
And just to make this clear to the listeners, since the beginning of the war, so in the last 3¼ years, I have given more than 2,200 interviews. That means I can't say that I'm being completely ghosted. Quite the opposite. So I do have access to media outlets. But then it's interesting, when you give so many interviews in different countries, in different languages, that one particular outlet completely ignores you, so to speak. And you could say, maybe not in a strictly scientific way, but still, that ghosting is happening here, that a certain viewpoint simply isn't supposed to be communicated anymore by such an outlet.
von einem solchen Medium.
Ja, und das haben wir das Problem, dass auch Patrick Baum häufiger.
Yes, and there we have the problem that Patrick Baum often points out as well, that right now there are more activists than journalists in newsrooms. Maybe one last question, because I'm simply curious. You are, among other things, attacked for having participated in conferences in Russia, including the most important ones, for simply being present there, even before 2022, and that's already being held against you. But all right, is it even possible at the moment to have any exchange with Russian colleagues? I had a discussion with a scientist from CERN, and he said that everything has been blocked at CERN as well. You're not allowed to publish with Russia at all anymore. For you, it's even more difficult, because Russia is not only home to colleagues, scientific colleagues, but is also partly the subject of your research. How has this exchange between Europe or Austria and so on, with Russia, changed over the last 3 years?
Wenn Sie erlauben, möchte ich noch ganz kurz auf diesen immer wieder.
If you allow me, I would like to briefly address this accusation that is repeatedly made against me, namely that I participated in the so-called Valdai conferences, in my case, from 2013 to 2018. It is true that these conferences are organized by the Russian presidential administration, and the presidential administration also decides who is invited or not. But I always participated in these conferences, just like many other colleagues from Europe, Asia, the United States, and North America in general, because we had the opportunity there, at a single geographic location in the conference hall, to meet with the who's who of international Russia research. And of course, that was a central motivation for me to participate in these conferences. But it is quite striking. I am being criticized for attending these conferences, even though I haven't participated since 2019, but it's never mentioned that people like Ivan Krashchev, Sabine Fischer, Angela Stent, Richard Sakwa, or others were also there, simply because the community of Russia researchers came together there to maintain this exchange. But this aspect, when you explain why you were there, what the benefit of this gathering was, and who else participated, that kind of reasoning just doesn't get through anymore. Instead, the whole thing is being narrowed down. Mangott attended Putin conferences, Kremlin conferences, and that supposedly documents his betrayal of integrity. Of course, that's something I encounter again and again, and I can't defend myself against it because my counter-arguments, which I've expressed here, are simply ignored. But back to your question. When the war began, let me put it this way. At my university, the University of Innsbruck, there was a so-called Russia Center, an interdisciplinary research institution that conducted research on Russia and collaborated with Russian colleagues, Russian institutes, and universities. When the war began, when Russia started the war, the rectorate of my university said that the center could no longer be called the Russia Center. Instead, it would now be an Eastern Europe Center with a focus also on Ukraine. And we were, and this is much more relevant than what I said before, specifically forbidden to collaborate with colleagues in Russia who do not clearly oppose this war, who do not clearly distance themselves from this war. That is also a completely, how should I put it, unrealistic position, because of course many scientists in Russia do not publicly oppose this war, not because they support it, but because opposing it would mean the end of their careers, if not worse, including possible arrest and imprisonment. And to say that only those who explicitly and publicly speak out against this war are still acceptable cooperation partners, and all others are definitely not. I was told, privately, you can of course do what you want, but professionally, that is unacceptable.
It makes no sense. Of course, it does make sense. We understand why this is happening. I just can't comprehend how anyone can blame a scientist for going to the country they are studying, exchanging ideas with people who are also studying it, and on top of that, experiencing firsthand how the current discourse is being conducted in the country they are researching. I mean, there are so many reasons why someone would want to attend these conferences. A and B. Especially when a war breaks out, it becomes all the more important to have a scientific understanding, especially among those who support it, not just those who oppose it, but those who support it, so that we can understand how this support comes about, so that we can find out what actually drives the political process within Russia. But all of that is currently being destroyed. The ability to interpret is currently being destroyed, and you are a part of this destruction of Europe's understanding of what is happening in Russia.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I would like to mention another colleague who is experiencing exactly the same thing. That is Johannes Warwick from the University of Halle, who is an expert in security policy and has repeatedly commented on the war in Ukraine. He is subjected to this flood of hate and these efforts to discredit him even more intensely than I am, although I am slowly catching up to him in that regard, being just as marginalized, criticized, and defamed. But he is also a respectable academic figure who rightfully holds a professorship. Yet he is systematically targeted to such an extent that this colleague, just as I am starting to do, no longer reads any comments on X, for example, because he knows there is a flood of orchestrated or non-orchestrated hate posts, and for him, as for me, it is simply not bearable without psychological consequences. Just to say, I am not alone in this. There are colleagues who think similarly. For example, Roland Popp at ETH Zurich, the military historian, finds himself in the same position. Almut Rakowanski, to name another, who is now a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute in the US, faces the same discrediting. What I mean is, it affects many, and at the same time I want to say, I am not alone. We are few, but we are at least still a mutually supportive scientific minority group.
Mr. Mangott, thank you very much for these remarks. And I just want to say, I never want to be remembered as someone who built walls and tore down bridges. So, if we focus on what we actually want to achieve, I feel that you are currently doing something commendable, namely, promoting understanding, not justification, but understanding of what is happening. That is a good thing. For people who would like to read more from you and are looking for your interpretations, where should they turn now, apart from the media outlets? Do you publish anywhere regularly?
Yes, I do publish. You can find me in academic journals, I also write books. I wrote a book about the background and course of the first years of the war regarding Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I believe it turned out to be a good book. Above all, it's a book that doesn't follow the mainstream because it doesn't pretend that the war just came out of nowhere. Instead, I try to contextualize the war within the framework and developments of the past decades. What's the title of the book? Russia, Ukraine, and the Future. The title is a bit banal, but the publisher chose it. But it's always an attempt to make clear how, in a way, various actors on both the Eastern and Western sides slid into this situation or even promoted it, sometimes not intentionally, but rather out of a lack of understanding for the other side. Let me repeat this, because otherwise it will immediately be interpreted negatively. Of course, Russia alone is responsible for starting this war. But the context is one in which Russia's wrong decision can be better understood. So, you can follow what I write and what I say also at conferences, but the listeners here won't have that opportunity. You can still hear me, though at fewer and fewer conferences. What's especially important to me is what my university calls the third mission, namely communicating with society through as many media as possible, in the spirit of enlightenment, interpretation, and providing support for those people who are seeking orientation.
Congratulations on continuing with this work. Please keep it up. I will include your book, your homepage, and other links in the description of this video. Professor Mangott, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you as well for the opportunity to speak about this.